A wild Mustang appeared out of nowhere, standing face to face with an elderly woman in a wheelchair. No one could believe what happened next, not even her. And when the truth came out, it shocked the entire town. "You'll never walk again." The words crashed into Margaret like a war hammer, leaving her breathless. The hospital room blurred, her vision tunneling as her brain refused to process what had just been said. The doctor's voice was calm, practiced, but it didn't soften the blow. No, that couldn't be right. She clenched the sheets beneath her, panic clawing up her throat as she tried, desperately, to move her legs. Nothing. No tingling, no twitch, no sign that her body still belonged to her. Just dead weight, an emptiness where strength had once lived. "This isn't happening," she choked out. "You don't understand. I'm a royal knight. I protect people. I can't—" Her breath hitched, her words breaking apart. The doctor gave her a look of quiet pity. "I'm sorry, Margaret. The bullet severed your spinal cord. The damage is irreversible." Irreversible. The finality of it shattered something inside her. A sob tore through the room, but it wasn't hers. Daniel, her husband, her rock, the man who had always met the world with unwavering certainty, was now breaking apart before her eyes. His shoulders trembled as he buried his face in his hands, his body racked with grief. And then, as if he couldn't hold himself up any longer, he dropped onto the chair beside her bed and reached for her. "I'm so sorry, Maggie," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "God, I wish it was me instead." She wanted to tell him to stop, to pull herself together, to be the warrior she had always been. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She was nothing, a knight without a horse, a guardian without a purpose. And so she did the only thing left to do. She wept. 45 years later. The morning wind rolled across the open plains, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant rain. Margaret Peterson, 78 years old, sat motionless on the porch of her small, aging house, her wheelchair as still as the wooden beams beneath it. She had lived here for decades, perched on the edge of the wilderness, watching the world go on without her. She had learned to exist in the stillness. But that didn't mean she had ever accepted it. She had tried. Lord, she had tried. The years after the injury had been grueling. The endless, humiliating struggle of physical therapy. The aching hope that maybe, just maybe, she would prove the doctors wrong. The nights spent lying awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling her own body as a prison she could never escape. And Daniel, dear devoted Daniel, had been by her side through it all. He had loved her when she could no longer dance in his arms, had carried her when she could no longer walk beside him. And then, one day, he was gone, a heart attack in his sleep, sudden, unforgiving. She had woken up expecting to see him in the kitchen, humming some old tune as he made coffee. Instead, she had found herself alone in a house that now felt too big, too empty. The grief had nearly swallowed her whole. Losing her legs had been unbearable. Losing Daniel had been worse. If not for Emma, she wasn't sure she would have made it. Emma, her only grandchild, had been just a teenager then, too young to bear the weight of caring for an aging grandmother. But she had done it anyway. She had visited every week, bringing food, sitting with Margaret on the porch, talking about school, about life, about anything to fill the silence. She had grown into a smart, capable woman, now in her 30s, building a life of her own. Still, she came. Still, she made sure Margaret never felt completely forgotten. But there were things Emma couldn't understand. The longing, the deep, unshakable ache of remembering what it felt like to be more than just a woman in a wheelchair. Margaret's gaze followed the movement in the distance, the wild mustangs, their dark silhouettes cutting through the golden fields. They were strong, untamed, running in perfect rhythm with the land itself. She had spent years watching them, longing for something she could never have again. She could still feel it, the solid weight of a saddle beneath her, the power of a gallop, the wind pulling at her clothes as she and her horse moved as one. She had lived for that feeling once, and then she had lost it. So she watched the Mustangs instead. For 20 years, nothing had changed. But today felt different. The morning light filtered through the thinning autumn mist as Margaret wheeled herself onto the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the quiet promise of winter. She adjusted her shawl, settling into her usual spot, eyes drifting to the plains where the Mustangs roamed. Then she saw it. A Mustang. Not just any Mustang. This one stood at the very edge of her property, closer than any wild horse had ever dared to come. Margaret's breath caught. It was black as midnight, its coat sleek and glistening under the rising sun. Its eyes were sharp, intelligent, but uncertain. A hesitation in the way it held itself, as if it was considering something it had never considered before. Wild horses didn't approach people. They didn't cross into human territory. And yet, this one had. Margaret's fingers tightened around the armrests of her wheelchair. She didn't dare move, afraid that the slightest shift would send the creature bolting. She had spent her life studying horses, reading the unspoken language of their bodies. And this one was watching her, truly watching her, as if trying to understand what she was. She swallowed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What are you doing here?" The Mustang flicked its ears. It did not run. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. A connection, thin as a thread, invisible but undeniable, hummed between them. She had spent decades feeling unseen, unnoticed by the world she once belonged to, but in that moment, she felt something shift. And then, a sharp cry pierced the air. A bird startled from the nearby brush. The Mustang flinched. Margaret barely had time to whisper, "No," before it turned, its hooves striking against the earth as it disappeared over the ridge. She sat frozen, heart hammering against her ribs, the ghost of its presence lingering in the air. It was only a moment, a brief, fleeting moment. But she knew deep in her bones that it meant something. That afternoon when Emma arrived, Margaret was still thinking about the Mustang. "A horse came up to me this morning," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Emma, unloading groceries, barely looked up. "A wild one?" "Yes," her granddaughter chuckled. "That's impossible, Grandma. Wild horses don't come near people." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know what I saw," she said firmly. Emma only smiled, indulging her as if she were humoring a child. "All right, if you say so." Margaret didn't argue, but deep down she knew this wasn't real. At the break of dawn, Margaret maneuvered her wheelchair onto the porch, settling into her usual spot. The first light of morning spilled across the vast plains, turning the horizon into a canvas of soft oranges and golds. Her eyes lingered on the open land, scanning every inch with a quiet hope, searching for any sign of the Mustang from the day before. The hours slipped by, the sky shifting from dawn's gentle glow to the bright stretch of midday. The world remained unchanged, silent, still, unremarkable. Just as she reached for the wheels to turn herself back inside, a distant sound made her freeze. A faint but steady rhythm, hooves drumming against the earth. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the plains, her hands gripping the armrests. And there it was, the Mustang, the same wild creature that had appeared the previous morning. This time, it wasn't merely a passing shadow on the land. It was moving toward her, its steps slow and measured, each movement careful yet deliberate. Margaret's pulse quickened. She had spent years watching wild horses from a distance, admiring their grace and power, but none had ever dared to approach a human like this. There was something different about this one, something neither timid nor reckless but curious. The Mustang stopped just feet from her porch, standing motionless as its dark eyes locked onto hers. Margaret inhaled sharply, her fingers trembling as she extended a hand, instinct overriding reason. "Hey there," she whispered. The Mustang didn't startle. Instead, it flared its nostrils, drawing in her scent, assessing her in a way that felt almost human. The air between them hummed with an unspoken understanding, as if the animal recognized something in her that no one else did. Unlike the day before, it didn't flee. It lingered, lowering its head to graze but never straying too far. Margaret sat in silence, a warmth spreading through her chest, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She had spent so many years fading into the background, unseen, unnoticed. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't just another old woman in a wheelchair. She was something worth acknowledging. As the days passed, the Mustang returned, inching closer with each visit. Margaret, in turn, began leaving small buckets of water at the porch's edge, a silent invitation. It wasn't long before she gave him a name, Shadow. It fit, given the way his dark coat blended seamlessly with the twilight, making him almost a part of the land itself. Emma, however, wasn't convinced when Margaret told her about the horse. "Wild horses don't just walk up to people, Grandma. Are you sure you're not imagining things?" Margaret gave a knowing smile. "Sometimes the wild recognizes the broken, Emma, and maybe it sees something in me that you don't." But not everyone in town shared Margaret's reverence for Shadow. Tom, a local rancher, had spotted the Mustang near his cattle and didn't like it one bit. One afternoon he stopped by, tipping his hat back as he eyed Margaret warily. "That horse is trouble," he warned. "They spook the herds, and if it keeps hanging around here, someone's bound to come after it." Margaret's chest tightened. She knew exactly what happened to Mustangs that wandered too close to human settlements, captured, corralled, sometimes even worse. Shadow was no different. If he was seen as a nuisance, people wouldn't hesitate to get rid of him. That evening she sat on her porch, staring at the darkening plains, feeling a knot of fear settle deep in her stomach. Shadow appeared once again, this time approaching without hesitation. As their eyes met, something inside her solidified. If the world was against him, she would stand by his side, even if it meant turning against the very people she had known for decades. From then on, Shadow's visits became a part of her daily life. Each morning, she wheeled herself outside, heart lifting the moment she saw his dark silhouette against the sunlit grass. His guarded nature slowly faded, replaced by something resembling trust. One warm afternoon, she reached out, a carrot resting in her open palm. "Good morning, Shadow," she said softly. The Mustang hesitated, his ears flicking back and forth, weighing the risk. Then, cautiously, he stepped forward, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the offering. Margaret held her breath, fearing that even the slightest movement might startle him away. Yet, to her astonishment, Shadow stretched his neck forward and gently took the carrot from her outstretched hand, his velvety muzzle grazing her palm. A laugh burst from Margaret, light, unrestrained, the kind of laughter she hadn't heard from herself in years. It wasn't the forced chuckle of politeness, nor the half-hearted response to conversation. It was pure, uninhibited joy. Shadow lingered that afternoon, nibbling on the grass just a few yards away, while Margaret sat motionless, watching him with an awe that filled the hollow spaces in her chest. News of the peculiar Mustang and his unlikely companion began to ripple through town. Neighbors, drawn by curiosity, stopped by to catch a glimpse of the wild horse that had chosen the company of a frail old woman. Some were enchanted by the bond, murmuring about how remarkable it was, while others, particularly Tom, the gruff rancher, saw nothing but trouble. One afternoon he stood at the base of Margaret's porch, his voice edged with irritation. "That horse doesn't belong here, Margaret," he said firmly. "You're only making it harder for him to stay wild." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "He's not causing any harm, Tom. He's just looking for something." Her voice softened, but there was no mistaking the conviction in it. "And so am I." Despite Tom's disapproval, Margaret continued to care for Shadow. She left out fresh water and hay, arranging a small, quiet space near the porch where he could rest without fear. Each day, he ventured closer, his wariness giving way to trust. Soon he allowed her trembling hands to brush against his coat, her fingers tracing the strong, untamed lines of muscle beneath his skin. To Margaret, these moments were more than simple companionship. They were a thread connecting her to the life she had lost. Every soft exhale from Shadow, every warm breath against her hand, chipped away at the loneliness that had settled in her bones for years. In him, she saw a reflection of herself, wild at heart, unwilling to be forgotten, fighting for freedom in a world that tried to tame them both. But peace is never meant to last. One afternoon, as Shadow grazed in the yard, the deep, throaty growl of an approaching engine shattered the stillness. Margaret's stomach tightened. She knew that sound. Tom's truck rattled up her driveway, kicking up a swirl of dust before coming to a stop. He stepped out, his face drawn and serious. "Margaret, I told you," he began, his voice steady but laced with warning. "That Mustang's been spotted near my herd again. If he causes trouble, the county won't hesitate to put him down, and I won't be able to stop them." Margaret's grip tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. A flicker of uncertainty passed through her, but she pushed it down. "Shadow isn't a threat, Tom. He's just lost, like so many of us are." Tom exhaled, shaking his head as if he'd already resigned himself to the argument. "You can't save every wild thing, Margaret. Sometimes nature takes its course." That night, Margaret sat on the porch long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The plains stretched before her in endless shadows, and there, standing at the edge of the land, was Shadow. He was barely more than a silhouette, his dark form outlined by the glow of the moon. She watched him, her heart heavy yet resolute. A single tear slid down her cheek. For so many years, she had felt powerless. Now, for the first time, she had something worth fighting for. A week later, the peace of the plains was shattered as a storm rolled in from the west, thick clouds swallowing the sky. The air turned heavy, charged with the scent of impending rain. Margaret sat outside, watching the sky shift, gripping the arms of her wheelchair with quiet tension. Shadow hadn't come that day. The absence gnawed at her. When the first fat drops of rain spattered against the wooden porch, a sharp unease crawled beneath her skin. His visits had become a constant, a rhythm to her otherwise still days. Now, with the storm brewing and no sign of him, an unsettling fear crept in. By the time the storm struck in full force, wind howled through the open land, bending the tall grass under its might. Rain lashed against the windows, drumming against the roof with relentless fury. The plains, usually so calm and sprawling, had transformed into something fierce and unrelenting. Margaret wheeled herself closer to the window, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Where was he? Had he found shelter? Or was he out there, braving the storm alone? The night dragged on, the storm raging with unrelenting force. Thunder rumbled through the vast plains, shaking the very bones of the earth, while rain lashed against the windows in relentless sheets. Sleep eluded Margaret. Her thoughts tangled with worry for Shadow. Each gust of wind outside felt like a threat, each crash of thunder an omen. Would he make it through the night? Had he found shelter, or was he out there, battling the elements alone? At first light, the storm finally loosened its grip, leaving the land drenched and shimmering under the dawn's hesitant glow. Margaret wasted no time, wheeling herself onto the porch, her breath misting in the crisp morning air. Her eyes swept over the sodden fields, searching, hoping, and then her chest tightened. There he was. Shadow emerged from behind a distant cluster of trees, moving with an unsteady gait. His sleek black coat was soaked and streaked with mud, his usual fluid movements replaced with a halting, painful shuffle. Something was wrong. Margaret's heart lurched at the sight of him, and before she could stop herself, she called out, desperation thick in her voice. "Shadow! Over here!" The Mustang's ears flicked up at the sound of her voice. Even from a distance, she could see the hesitation in his posture, the way he fought against the pain with each laborious step. But he didn't turn away. Slowly, painfully, he limped toward her, his powerful frame weighed down by exhaustion. By the time he reached the porch, Margaret could see the cause of his struggle. A deep, jagged wound slashed across his front leg, likely from flying debris during the storm. The injury was raw and cruel, the edges caked with mud. Margaret swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she wheeled herself closer. "Oh, Shadow," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. He was hurt, and badly. Leaving him like this wasn't an option, but tending to an injured wild horse was dangerous, nearly impossible. Margaret knew that, and yet, as she reached out, her fingers barely grazing his damp, shivering coat, she felt no fear, only an overwhelming need to help. Shadow tensed beneath her touch, flinching instinctively. For a moment she thought he might bolt, that the trust they had built would shatter in an instant. But then, just as quickly, he stilled. He didn't move away. He let her stay. Taking his acceptance as a silent plea, Margaret turned toward the house, retrieving a clean towel and antiseptic. Her movements were slow, deliberate, every action meant to reassure him. As she dabbed at the wound, wiping away dirt and blood, Shadow remained motionless, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a depth that felt almost human. Margaret's heart ached. He wasn't just a wild animal, he was a survivor, like her. The news of Shadow's injury spread quickly through town. Some neighbors murmured their sympathies, but others, like Tom, saw it as further proof that the Mustang was a problem. "You can't keep nursing that horse, Margaret," Tom warned one afternoon, his arms crossed over his chest. "If he starts relying on you, he'll forget how to survive on his own, and if he keeps hanging around people, someone's going to report him." Margaret met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "He came to me because he needed help," she said firmly. "Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Help when we can?" The days that followed tested both Margaret's resolve and Shadow's resilience. She did what she could, cleaning his wound, speaking to him in the same soothing voice she had once used with her own horses. Emma helped when she could, bringing fresh hay and buckets of water, watching in quiet awe as the Wild Mustang allowed her grandmother to tend to him. Little by little, Shadow improved. His limp grew less pronounced, his strength returning with each passing day. And with his recovery came something unexpected, Margaret's own renewal. Every morning when she wheeled herself outside, she found him waiting. The sight of him standing against the rising sun filled her with something she hadn't felt in years: purpose, connection, life. For so long, she had existed in a world that had grown smaller and smaller, confined to the walls of her home, the limits of her body. But Shadow had changed that. He had given her back something she thought she had lost forever. Not everyone saw it that way. Tom's warnings escalated into outright threats. "Margaret," he said one afternoon, standing on her porch with his hat in hand, his face grim. "The county's been hearing complaints about a Mustang hanging too close to human property. They're sending a team out next week to round him up." The words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. "Round him up?" she echoed, her voice unsteady. You mean take him to one of those holding facilities? Tom let out a weary sigh, his hardened expression softening just slightly. It's the right thing to do, Margaret. Wild horses don't belong near people. It's too risky, for them and for us. Margaret tightened her grip on the worn arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles turning white. He's not a threat, Tom. He's just trying to survive, the same as we are. But even as she spoke, she felt the heavy weight of reality pressing down on her. Wild Mustangs taken by authorities rarely found a good fate. Most ended up crammed into overcrowded holding facilities, stripped of their freedom. Some were even sold off to unknown buyers, their futures uncertain at best, grim at worst. The mere thought of Shadow being torn away from the open plains, locked behind fences, made her stomach twist. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat on her porch, staring into the fading light. Shadow stood just a short distance away, his powerful frame outlined against the dimming sky. He was wild, untamed, a spirit of the land itself. The idea of him being taken away, his freedom stolen, was unbearable. But what could she do? She was an old woman in a wheelchair. She couldn't fight this battle alone. The answer came the next day from an unexpected source. Emma arrived for her usual weekly visit, bringing fresh groceries and the warmth of companionship. As they sat together, Margaret told her about the impending roundup. She expected the same dismissive response she had received before: gentle doubt, quiet reassurance that she was worrying too much. But this time, Emma didn't brush her off. Instead, she sat in thoughtful silence, her brow furrowed. "What if we find somewhere safer for him?" Emma finally suggested. "There's that wildlife sanctuary a few towns over. They have land set aside for Mustangs. It's not the wild, but it's better than what's coming for him." Margaret's eyes widened, a spark of hope flickering to life. "Do you think they'd take him?" "I can call and find out," Emma replied, already reaching for her phone. The response from the sanctuary was better than Margaret had dared to hope for. They were willing to take Shadow, provided they could transport him safely. But that was easier said than done. Catching and relocating a wild horse was no small task, and Margaret knew that Shadow wouldn't trust just anyone. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Emma made the necessary arrangements, securing a horse trailer and enlisting the help of a local vet to oversee the transport. Margaret, in turn, spent every spare moment with Shadow, speaking to him in hushed tones, trying to prepare him for what was to come. She wasn't sure if he understood her words, but she hoped he could feel the reassurance in her voice. When the day of the move arrived, tension hung thick in the air. The vet and Emma moved carefully, their motions slow and deliberate as they coaxed Shadow toward the trailer. His ears flicked back in uncertainty, his muscles tensing. He stomped the ground, uneasy. "It's all right, boy," Margaret murmured from her wheelchair, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "You're going somewhere safe, I promise." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but at last, Shadow hesitated, then stepped forward. The trailer door swung shut behind him with a heavy clang, sealing his fate. Margaret's heart clenched. She had done what was right, but the sight of him enclosed, trapped in that metal box, made her chest ache. As the truck pulled away, kicking up a trail of dust behind it, Margaret remained on the porch, her hands clasped in her lap. The plains stretched before her, vast and empty. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She had fought for Shadow, but the weight of their parting was heavier than she had anticipated. As the trailer disappeared over the horizon, she had fought for Shadow, but the weight of their parting was heavier than she had anticipated. As the trailer disappeared over the horizon, Margaret's porch felt emptier than it had in years. Shadow's presence had filled a void she hadn't realized was so deep. Now she sat alone, grappling with the bittersweet mix of relief and loss. She had fought to save him, but the price of doing so was a parting she wasn't ready for. Emma called later that evening, her voice warm and reassuring. "Grandma, Shadow's going to be all right. The sanctuary is wonderful. Rolling hills, open fields, so much space for him to run. He'll be happy there." Margaret listened, nodding even though Emma couldn't see her through the phone. She knew in her heart that this was the right decision, the only way to keep Shadow safe. But knowing didn't make it any easier. That night, sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, standing at the edge of the trailer, his deep, trusting gaze locked onto hers, uncertainty flickering in the darkness of his eyes. Did he understand why she had let him go? Or did he feel abandoned, betrayed by the one person who had promised to protect him? The days that followed passed in a quiet haze. Margaret's routine resumed, yet something was missing. The plains, once alive with Shadow's presence, now felt vast and empty, the silence stretching too far. She missed the steady rhythm of his hooves, the soft sound of him grazing, the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. Then, a week after Shadow had left, Emma arrived with a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "The sanctuary invited us to visit," she announced with a smile. "They want you to see how he's settling in." Margaret's heart leapt. The idea of seeing Shadow again sent a rush of warmth through her, filling the void that had lingered since he left. "When can we go?" she asked, her voice eager in a way it hadn't been in years. The visit was arranged for the upcoming weekend. Emma packed Margaret's wheelchair into the trunk, helping her into the car with careful ease. As they drove, Margaret watched the familiar landscapes pass by, but her thoughts remained with Shadow. Would he remember her? Would he still trust her after everything? The sanctuary sat nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by rolling green hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Wide, open pastures spread out before her, filled with wild mustangs grazing under the afternoon sun. A friendly staff member greeted them and led them toward Shadow's enclosure. Margaret's hands tightened against the arms of her wheelchair as they approached. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow with anticipation. Then she saw him. Shadow stood near the fence line, his black coat gleaming like polished onyx beneath the sunlight. He no longer limped, his stance once again proud and unbroken, his presence commanding as if he had never known pain. Margaret wheeled forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Shadow." His ears flicked at the sound. He turned toward her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, he was still, as if processing, remembering. Then, to the astonishment of those watching, he began to walk toward her, slow, deliberate, each step carrying the weight of recognition. Margaret's breath hitched. She extended her hand, her fingers trembling as he lowered his head, his soft muzzle brushing against her palm. Tears welled in her eyes and slipped down her cheeks, unchecked. "You remember me?" she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. A smile spread across the sanctuary worker's face. "He's been doing great here," they said, "but it's clear, you two have something special." Margaret spent the rest of the day by Shadow's side, speaking to him in the same soft voice she always had. She stroked his neck, feeling the strength beneath his coat, the steady rise and fall of his breath. She had fought for him, given everything to protect him, and now she knew he was where he belonged. When it was time to leave, her heart ached, but it was a different kind of pain, one not of loss, but of quiet acceptance. Shadow was free, living the life he was meant to live. As she said goodbye, she whispered, "Be happy, Shadow. You'll always have a piece of my heart." The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of sorrow. It was peaceful, filled with the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done something good, something that mattered. For the first time in years, Margaret felt like she had truly made a difference. The days that followed were brighter. Margaret spent her mornings on the porch, not waiting for Shadow to appear, but simply enjoying the beauty of the plains. She still felt his absence, the quiet spaces where his presence had once lingered, but knowing he was thriving in a place where he truly belonged brought her a deep, settled peace. Wanting to preserve every memory, she took to writing, filling the pages of a worn leather journal with recollections of her time with Shadow, the lessons of resilience, trust, and the silent, profound bond they had shared. Word of Margaret's unusual connection with the Mustang spread through the small town. People who had once dismissed her stories as the musings of an old woman now came by, curiosity in their eyes, eager to hear about the horse that had defied all expectations. Even Tom, the no-nonsense rancher who had once considered Shadow a nuisance, eventually made his way up her driveway. "I heard you got him into that sanctuary," he said, tipping his hat in a rare gesture of respect. "Guess I was wrong about you two. Took guts to do what you did." Margaret met his gaze, her eyes gleaming with quiet understanding. "He taught me more about courage than I ever could have taught him." Emma, inspired by her grandmother's unwavering determination, began spending her weekends at the sanctuary, lending a hand to care for the rescued Mustangs. Each time she returned, she brought stories of Shadow, who had become something of a legend among the staff. "They say he's a leader," Emma told Margaret one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the last light of day melt into the horizon. "He's always the first to step into new pastures, and the others follow. It's like he knows he's finally free." Margaret's chest swelled with emotion. She had always known Shadow was different, but hearing how he had embraced his new life reassured her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. One afternoon, Emma suggested hosting a fundraiser to support the sanctuary, ensuring that more Mustangs like Shadow would have a safe place to go. Margaret agreed without hesitation, offering to share her story as part of the event. The gathering was held in her backyard, where the crisp evening air carried the scent of warm cider and fresh hay. Neighbors, friends, and even members of the sanctuary staff gathered under strings of golden lights, their faces alight with anticipation. Margaret took a steady breath, her hands resting on the arms of her wheelchair as she looked out over the familiar faces. Then, with quiet conviction, she began, "I spent years feeling trapped by my circumstances, my body, and my own mind. But then a wild Mustang came into my life. Shadow reminded me that freedom isn't just about where you are, it's about how you choose to live." Her words struck a chord, weaving their way through the hearts of those who listened. By the end of the evening, they had raised enough to help provide food, shelter, and medical care for several more Mustangs at the sanctuary. A warmth settled over Margaret, not just from the success of the event, but from the certainty that Shadow's story was reaching far beyond her own life. As the seasons passed, her connection with Shadow remained unwavering. Emma often took her to visit, where Shadow would greet her with the same gentle nuzzle as if no time had passed between them. Every visit strengthened the invisible thread that bound them together, a bond that had transcended the limitations of species, time, and fate itself. On a crisp autumn morning, Margaret sat on her porch, watching the golden sunlight stretch across the plains. She thought about Shadow, running free in the sanctuary's vast pastures, leading his herd with the same strength and grace that had first drawn her to him. A soft smile touched her lips as she whispered to the wind, "Thank you, Shadow, for reminding me what it means to truly live." Margaret's life had been changed forever by a wild Mustang, and though their time together had been brief, the lessons he had left behind would echo in her heart for the rest of her days. Wow, what a journey this story has been. Shadow and Margaret's bond is something truly special, and even though this story isn't real, I think it speaks to something deep within all of us. It's not just about a woman and a wild Mustang. It's about resilience, about finding purpose, even when life feels like it's taken everything from you. Margaret's story reminds us that no matter how much we lose, there's always something worth holding on to. She lost her ability to walk, lost the life she once knew, and even lost the love of her life. And yet, in the quiet loneliness of her days, she found something unexpected. Connection. Not with another person, but with a creature just as untamed, just as lost in the world as she was. And isn't that what we all crave? To be understood, even when words aren't enough? And Shadow. He's more than just a horse. He represents the wild, the free spirit inside us that refuses to be caged. The way he slowly learned to trust Margaret, and how she in turn found the courage to fight for him, is such a powerful reminder that sometimes the things we try to save end up saving us. This story isn't real, but its message is. It's about kindness, about second chances, about the incredible way that love, whether for a person or an animal, can change our lives forever. So, what do you guys think? Did this story move you the way it did me? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. See you in the next one.